Hi, I'm Aidan Cooper, and this is the World Sport, Globalization of Football and the World Cup. Football is the biggest sport in the world, and the 2018 World Cup in Russia managed to capture the attention of 3.5 billion people. That's half of the global population older than 4 years old. The tournament brings an economic boom to the country that is lucky enough to host it each year, and countries battle years in advance for this privilege. However, the Federation International Football Association, or FIFA, has large expectations for massive stadiums to be built, and being responsible for reaching these standards is a very difficult task, especially for the case of the Brazilian World Cup in 2014. The following World Cup in Russia had problems of its own with crowd violence, as well as social and political prejudices, creating concern for the social atmosphere and safety of foreign tourists. And the upcoming 2022 World Cup in Qatar is also already facing some serious problems. 8 massive stadiums had to be built, and these World Cup projects brought international scrutiny on the Qatari nation. Some important definitions are globalization. With this topic, in a broader sense, is talking about the process that encompasses the causes, course, and consequences of transnational and transcultural integration of human and non-human activities. In a broader sense, we talk about globalization of soccer in the context of the change over the last few decades, and how now people watch and players travel all across the world to play in the most competitive leagues. The Federation International Football Association, or FIFA, is the world's governing body for the sport, and also the promoter of the biggest international soccer competitions, as well as the World Cup. FIFA doesn't only have high standards for the stadiums, but also infrastructure. FIFA needs to make sure that the country is prepared to host the millions of tourists by doing work on the public transport and airports as well. And a term you may be familiar with, hooliganism. Football hooliganism refers to the intense emotional connection between fans and the teams they support. Hooliganism is often the radicalization of these feelings, resulting in riots, violence that are often motivated by social, political, or religious issues. As a result of globalization and media coverage, the sport and football culture is under pressure to reform itself. Some of these areas including the arguments over gender equality, technology, racism, and hooliganism, are causing the sport to change. Despite these fierce challenges, countries like Brazil, Russia, and Qatar hope to secure the economic benefits of the tournament, but are left with unforeseen consequences and the struggle to preserve the country's image under a massive global spotlight. When Brazil's bid was accepted in 2007, little did they know the eventual economic and social costs of the tournament. Underdeveloped countries like Brazil were removed from the revenue of the European Football Association, or UEFA, and there was no foreign investors to grow the game in local centers of influence like the European leagues. Countries like Brazil that hosted in the past hope for economic impact, but they also hope to be put on the global map, and the World Cup was a good way to show that to the world. However, to get these benefits, the country had to be prepared to handle modern expectations, and this put the country in a scramble to clean up infrastructure and corruption. Both of these setbacks made FIFA requirements harder to fulfill due to problems with environmental licensing, poor planning, and funding issues. The difficulty to mobilize and revamp infrastructure led to the entire project being way behind schedule and corners being cut. And Sepp Blatter, the president of FIFA at the time, said that in all of his experiences with World Cups in the past, he had never seen so much uncertainty in meeting deadlines. Leading up to the 2014 World Cup, the sitting government faced national elections, and it needed the World Cup to be a surefire success in order to assure re-election in the fall after the tournament. The campaign of sitting president Dilma Rousseff was already under pressure due to the poor economic showing and failure to meet promised growth targets in oil production, infrastructure projects, and fiscal discipline. This pressure led to the government needing to raise taxes and to build the stadiums at an increased pace. These actions, especially the taxes, angered many that belonged to Brazil's working class and essentially split the country in two. At the time, riots and protests were the last thing that the country would need, with billions of eyes from all the world soon to be on Brazil, with the World Cup and Olympic being hosted there 2 years later. This public response caused a political shift that occurred in 2018, where the country elected the current authoritarian president that we see today. The most recent tournament in Russia also faced challenges due to the country's political image. Football and politics have been connected for years, and leading up to the 2018 World Cup, it was cause for uncertainty. As a result, many countries worried about their citizens traveling to a country with an unstable political atmosphere. Eastern Europe in particular has used football to promote political motives since the early 70s. Political elites tried to use football to promote the communist agenda by using the sport as propaganda to symbolize the us versus them mentality of nationalism and capitalism. Polish fans in rural areas and the lower class used football to rebel against the current government policies. Fan culture that highlighted resistance against the communist political system has been a part of the game in Eastern Europe and fueled the hooliganism we see in football today. This hooliganism is what concerned many as the tournament was approaching in Russia, including the host country, who wondered if people from the West would come to this former communist country. Russia and Eastern European countries also have a recent tendency to react socially, which will impact a fan's decision to travel. The growing amount of global and European tournaments have led to fans from these countries showing their oppositions towards westernization. For example, in February 2016, during a Europa League match between Liga Warsaw and Ajax Amsterdam, Dutch fans were attacked in an act that was to be seen more than normal hooliganism, but rather an anti-globalization statement by the Polish Warsaw fans. Most acts of hooliganism transcend the game and have some sort of external influence, and this case would be no different. This was a result of resistance to Poland's growing global interest and motives. Similarly, in Russia, social movements concerning anti-globalization were spreading before the tournament. It was a big concern as it could potentially influence a foreign fan's likelihood to travel to Russia. It turns out that is exactly what happened. In a study done by Halmstad University, people were surveyed about the two most recent tournaments, the 2018 World Cup in Russia and the 2016 European Championship in France. The survey asked those who went about their perception of the host country before traveling there, and the results were staggering. For France, only 2.4% of travelers said they had a negative perception, while for Russia the number was 75.9% negative, with only a 2.9% positive. These numbers spoke to the reluctance of football fans to travel solely because of the country's image, and is probably what led to the decrease from the previous tournament, Brazil, and foreign fans that traveled the country by 500,000 people. However, when the survey asked the same exact question for the perception after they attended the tournament, the numbers completely changed. Russia's image as a travel destination was now only 3.1% negative, with 69.7% positive perception of the country. The fact that these numbers changed so drastically meant that if the country's image going into the tournament was more positively viewed, there would have been more tourists that came to Russia, and speaks to the power of what a tournament can do for the country's image. Looking forward to 2022, the World Cup will see Qatar be the smallest country to ever host a prestigious tournament. When Qatar was chosen, it was seen as a strange decision due to the lack of stadiums and the extreme climate forcing the tournament to be played in winter. Given these circumstances, the Qatari government wants to use this opportunity to announce itself as a legitimate actor on the world stage and disparage the uncultivated stereotype associated with Qatar and other Arab nations by the cultural West. However, Qatar's plan for an improved global image has already been soiled by alleged corruption. These allegations were most prevalent in the case of Qatari representative Mohammed bin Hammam and a representative from the FIFA executive committee who was removed from his position and banned from involvement in the sport for life due to his bribing of other members to elect him to the position of president of FIFA. The corruption of Hammam, combined with Qatar being an odd choice to host the tournament, caused football fans to question the validity of the process of selecting host and subsequent allegations of Qatar using money to influence the decision. Qatar, similar to Brazil, are also having trouble meeting the expectations set by FIFA to build massive stadiums and to house the tourists that will travel to the World Cup. The building of these stadiums are extremely expensive, but there is another problem with the construction: the labor. Much of the labor used to construct these stadiums were migrants from South Asia and the Middle East, and due to poor working conditions between 2010 and 2013, more than 1,300 workers died, with 4,000 more projected by the time the tournament will begin in 2022. Even while knowing these atrocities were happening, construction officials in Qatar pushed forward as it was the only way to ensure that the stadiums would be finished by the desired timetables. By doing this, it shows that people in charge of the process valued completion of the stadiums more than workers' lives and safety. As media outlets around the world began to pick this story up, a strong response against FIFA for their overlook of humanitarian guidelines to complete construction began to circulate on social media. Players and nations with massive platforms also responded to these human rights transgressions, and during the previous international break in March 2021, big players, including those that represent Germany, Netherlands, and Norway, wore shirts to protest Qatar's hosting of the World Cup and stand in support of human rights. However, this is a level of hypocrisy because with these acts of protest, and they are willing to wear shirts, but none have officially boycotted the event because of the economic loss that the country would face. Which begs the question, will the corrupt and unjust process of FIFA and the countries that host the tournament ever change? Regardless of this, these acts of protest grab the attention of people on social media around the world and has put even more pressure on officials coordinating the upcoming tournament. Football is an evolving sport with a rich history that has been analyzed through the lens of social, political, and economic events analogous to the rest of the world. By understanding how culture around the sport has changed due to globalization, it is easy to connect the sport's history back to political, economic, and social issues, and it helps to better understand them. The World Cup in Brazil perfectly shows how economic desires of a country can lead to the collapse of a political party. And Russia demonstrates how a country can respond through the sport to promote anti-globalization and political values. While the upcoming tournament in Qatar is placed under scrutiny by football associations around the world due to inadequate standards and a corruption scandal. Until these associations are willing to boycott the tournament, these issues will persist. These three events, although the problems are different, all have to deal with modern obstacles and ultimately take on the world's biggest event, as well as the problem of globalization. However, with the host nation being put in a global spotlight, these issues often spill onto the pitch, and this is why football is the only sport that can capture the world's passions and problems. Because the sport is bigger than a single person or organization, it changes with the times and speaks loudest while some choose to stay silent. Thank you.